Breaking news today: the repercussions of Belarus hosting Russian nuclear weapons are vast. The announcement by Russian President Vladimir Putin that Russia would deploy nuclear weapons to Belarus made headlines around the world, but in many respects it was foreseeable. Moscow is ramping up the conflict despite Western countries' refusal to reduce their military aid to Ukraine. Western leaders can't afford to ignore the nuclear threat, after all. Russia is also portraying the deployment as a response to long-standing requests by Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko, rather than just a decision made by both countries. Russia has repeatedly shown its respect for its ally by sending troops to Belarus for training exercises, most recently in February, before the invasion, and October of this year. When exactly Russian weapons might make their way to Belarus remains unclear. Putin only mentioned that training for Belarusian pilots to fly nuclear-capable planes would begin in April and that a nuclear weapons storage facility would be constructed in Belarus by July 1. The Russian president has stated that the weapons will not be transferred to the Belarusian military. The vague nature of the announcement seems to confirm that it is meant to convince Russia's enemies, primarily the United States, that they can still alter their course and reach an agreement with Russia to guarantee that the storage facility remains unoccupied. It's true that the Belarusian leader has been discussing the possible deployment of nuclear weapons in his country for almost 18 months now. However, if nuclear weapons in Belarus were required for military purposes, Russia would hardly have announced that publicly, in advance, and with a specific timeframe. He first suggested it as a possible response to the stationing of U.S. nuclear weapons in Poland in November 2021, well before the war in Ukraine broke out. Lukashenko probably had no idea that a war would break out soon or that Putin would want to use nuclear blackmail a year later. More likely, Minsk was engaging in a tried-and-true foreign policy exercise by offering the highest level of security in exchange for Moscow's possible political and economic support. The context of Lukashenko's threats suggests that he is also seeking the approval of his peers and sees nuclear weapons with the range to hit Vilnius, Warsaw, and Kyiv as a means to that end. The opportunity to intimidate Lithuania and Poland, however, will also mean that NATO will pay more attention to Belarus. If the conflict between Russia and Ukraine were to escalate globally, Belarusian nuclear weapons storage facilities, missile deployment sites, and airfields would become prime targets. It's tough to say whether Lukashenko would benefit more from the idea or not. Typical Belarusians are likely to be opposed to the plan, with surveys from Chatham House showing that 80% of the country's urban population is against the deployment of nuclear weapons in their country. With a new Russian military base in Belarus, ties to Russia would undoubtedly be strengthened. The situation in Minsk and Moscow hasn't changed much, however, because Putin is unlikely to allow a chaotic transition of power in Belarus at this point. There are already plenty of reasons for the Kremlin to abandon the military stronghold in Belarus that is under Lukashenko's control, and the deployment of nuclear weapons only adds to them. Naturally, Minsk will expect, and most likely receive, some form of economic aid in exchange. The war in Ukraine would have gone in a very different direction if Belarus hadn't cooperated, and now Lukashenko is assisting Moscow in its global nuclear blackmail. The Kremlin should not be so impolite as to ignore such unwavering support. For the past 6 months, Lukashenko has managed to stay out of the conflict. Since last October, there have been no shelling incidents between Belarus and Ukraine. The use of nuclear weapons would be a huge new development in Belarus's involvement, making it more difficult for Europeans who have argued for different sanctions for Minsk and Moscow to defend their position, while giving hawks like Poland and the Baltic states powerful new ammunition to support their long-standing argument that Lukashenko should be treated as part of the Russian regime. The fact that it's unlikely anyone asked Lukashenko's opinion on the issue will be taken into account by either side. Too many times he has threatened to ask Putin to restore Belarus's nuclear arsenal, which was removed in the mid-1990s. If nuclear weapons ever show up on Belarusian soil, Brussels has already threatened Minsk with new sanctions. While Western threats are real, they pale in comparison to the inevitable wrath of Russia should Lukashenko suddenly change his mind. The most painful sanctions have been in place for some time. Lobbyists at the United Nations and in the Global South will have a much harder time persuading EU hardliners to allow exports of potassium fertilizer from Belarus through the Lithuanian port of Klaipėda in light of the announcement. For months, EU officials have been debating the idea as a way to ease the world's food crisis, but lifting sanctions against Minsk now would look ridiculous. Finally, peace negotiators may not notice Belarus's complicity in this war so long as it continues to serve primarily as a corridor for Russian ground troops, their training range, and a base for Russian jets. However, the Belarusian question is likely to be discussed as part of any post-war settlement if Russia builds a permanent nuclear base in Belarus. It will be difficult to ignore the presence of nuclear weapons so close to Kyiv and 3 NATO member capitals, even if negotiations on a new European security architecture take place after Putin and Lukashenko are no longer in power. The West and Ukraine are now more likely to press for Belarus to reduce its military strength to levels at least as low as they were before the war. The outcome of a future peace settlement is becoming increasingly important to the future of Belarus as a state. Any future government in Minsk will have a difficult time independently severing economic and political ties with Russia. But it will be next to impossible once Russia begins stationing nuclear weapons in Belarus.